Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's briefing, the convergence of climate urgency and opportunity, which my colleague, Dr. Logan Mitchell, will be leading and will be spending the majority of time talking with all of you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Kraft, and I am the Government and Corporate Relations Manager for Utah Clean Energy. And with Logan and Sarah Wright, I help to manage our outreach on to leaders and community members on climate issues as part of an initiative we call the Climate and Clean Air Compact. And as part of that work, we try to hold regular briefings and discussions to talk about issues related to climate science and climate solutions. And so we're pleased to bring you this briefing and discussion today, and look forward to your questions and some discussion after Logan's remarks. Before I just do a quick intro of Logan, I wanted just a couple of quick logistical items. That this is a Zoom meeting, and you are everyone is, I can see, is muted themselves, which is great. But if you're welcome to leave your video on or off. But we'll please keep yourself muted, as we are recording this for discussion and sharing at a later time. And then if you have questions, throughout the presentation, we will seek to answer those and take people off of mute. So you can put those questions to Logan or to our team in your own words, but you're welcome to leave those in the group chat so we can have a record of that and everyone can see it. And with that, I'll just say, I'm going to hand things over to Logan. Many of you, I think, are generally familiar with Logan Mitchell from our team, who his formal title is climate scientist and energy analyst, but he has an impressive background as a research scientist in climate and air quality issues. Was at the University of Utah as a research professor for a long time. And we're so pleased to have him as part of our team. He also happens to hold a PhD from Oregon State University and is knowledgeable of this topic. So Logan, I hope I got that right, but I'm gonna hand things over to you and let you share your screen.
All right, thank you, Josh. Thank you everyone for joining this morning. And can you see the right screen here? That's full screen, great. So we're going to be talking about the convergence of climate urgency and opportunity. And this is something that I've been thinking about for the last several months, and we've finally gotten around to turn it into a presentation today, because I think that this framing of this question and these two competing realities, I think, is going to be really helpful as we move forward. This photo here that you're seeing is I took this past weekend down in Escalante. It's the Ring of Fire solar eclipse. So not really related to the topic at hand, but it's just kind of a fun recent photo happened. So there's the moon with the Ring of Fire around it. Okay. Just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know. Utah Clean Energy is a nonprofit organization, been around for a little over 20 years. I've been with UCE for about a year and a half now. We're a group of policy and regulatory experts and advocates for addressing climate change using a solution-centered approach. And our work really focuses on all parts of this challenge. We're working to get to zero emissions, and that the major buckets that falls in is transforming our homes and buildings, transforming our vehicle fleet to be emissions free, and then powering all of that with clean energy that's reliable and affordable. And then to make that all happen, we need key influencers across Utah and across the country working to make that happen. And that's part of why we're doing this. I mean, it's education about what's at stake and how we're actually going to get there. So to frame this discussion, as I've been thinking about it and having conversations with folks about this urgency and opportunity duality, this quote from S. Scott Fitzgerald came up. And I think it's a really great way of thinking about this challenge. And it's actually a very simple concept. The quote's a test of intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and retain the ability to function. And that really gets at the heart of this, because we're in the climate challenge, we're faced with two competing realities at the same time. And we have to hold both of those realities in our minds and retain the ability to function to continue to make progress. So what are we talking about here? On the one hand, we have immense climate urgency. And this is, we're seeing increasingly devastating impacts on society. In this world, every 10th of a degree of warming matters and increases the costs and risks of climate change. But on the other hand, and at the very same time, we're in the middle of a clean energy revolution that's at the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but it's going to play out in a couple of decades instead of over a century. So what I'm going to do today is walk through and flesh out these realities for you, with you, and then we're going to talk about where we are today and where we're heading, both here in Utah and around the world. So we're going to start with climate impacts, and these have been getting increasingly dire over time. We're starting to see, especially this past summer and over the past few years, climate records that are falling seemingly every single day. There's a new climate record, and it's really tough to keep up with it all. There's just so much news. For example, this summer, there were immense wildfires across Canada, and that both severely impacts air quality. It also releases a ton of carbon into the air. And these massive wildfires in Canada, in Utah, we've had a relatively low impact summer in terms of air quality, but on the East Coast, it's been really bad this year. And so we're seeing these climate impacts shift around from year to year. Another huge impact that has been getting a lot of attention is this massive coral bleaching that's been happening in the Caribbean this year. And, that's really impactful because coral is a keystone species that supports this really unique ecosystem. But even more than that, we're seeing coral bleaching happening around the world, and 1 billion people rely on fish as their primary protein source. And as the coral starts to die, that ecosystem starts to degrade, and that puts in a really important source of food at risk for 1 billion people. It's massive. We're also seeing a really interesting trend with insurance companies recognizing climate risks and deciding they don't want to cover places that are at high risk for climate impacts. We're seeing this in places that have severe flooding, but even places that have severe wildfire risk. And we're seeing this in Utah already. Insurers are pulling out of Park City and telling folks that they won't insure their homes because the risk of wildfires is too great. This is one of the dominoes in the economics of climate, and it's starting to fall, and it's only getting worse. At the very same time, we're seeing climate solutions ramp up. This is Rocky Mountain Power's energy plan, their integrated resource plan that they look at every 2 years. In the most recent plan that came out, renewable energy is skyrocketing. You can see fossil fuel energy from PacifiCorp's and Rocky Mountain Power's network falling over the next decade. Meanwhile, clean energy is ramping up. That's the least cost, least risk plan. And renewable energy is now on par or cheaper than coal and gas. This planned addition of renewable energy is going to mean a 90% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2034. This past year, the US passed the biggest investment in climate solutions in our history. It's massive. And we're seeing clean energy getting deployed across the country. We're also seeing manufacturing for clean energy technologies being brought back to our shores, huge increase in jobs. This is really amazing. And it's not just in the US, it's all around the world. This is a chart showing global investment in clean energy globally and how it's changing and how it's accelerating beyond fossil fuels. So we're seeing this change around the world. And it's not just clean energy, it's electric vehicles. This is a chart showing electric vehicle adoption in different parts of the world. So you can see globally on the far left, but China there in the middle point here, they just passed in 2022, they just passed 30% of new vehicle sales are all electric. Here in the US, we're still below 10%, but we're not far behind. And China went from where we are today, less than 10%, to nearly 30% in just 2 years. Dramatic acceleration of the pace. And as we're watching that happen, Sinopec, the China's largest oil refiner, they brought forward their forecast of peak oil consumption in China by 2 years, and they think they've actually passed peak oil consumption, and the oil consumption is going to start falling. And we're seeing the same trend happening in Utah, of course. Utah is tracking roundabouts the US average EV adoption rate. But we could be going much faster. To a large extent, the pace of EV adoption in Utah is going to play a crucial role in improving our air quality. So it would be great if we could be leading the country, actually. We would have huge benefits locally if we could accelerate this trend. What's really exciting to me, though, is that we've passed the critical 5% threshold. We passed it in 2021. Once you cross 5% of new vehicle sales or any technology adoption, that's when things start to get mainstream, and that's when the S-curve starts to get steeper and you get faster and faster adoption. We passed that a couple of years ago, and we're starting to see this acceleration. It's really exciting. It's a really dynamic time. Yet at the same time, we are still too far behind where we need to be. This is a chart showing global greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons of CO2 per year. And you can see where we've been historically and where we are today. You can see this little downward dip. That was the COVID pandemic. And we can also see where we need to go, how fast we need to reduce emissions in order to stay below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Those are steep reductions. Here's how I think about this chart. This chart is not only a chart showing the pace of emissions, but it also, because emissions are proportional to warming, it also tells you the speed that we're modifying our climate. And as we're higher on this graph, it means that we're driving more rapid warming, which is going to lead to higher costs and higher risk. And the challenge that we're facing is to get down this graph as fast as possible to a stable climate system, which has lower risks and lower costs. It doesn't, when we get down to the bottom of this graph, it doesn't mean temperatures are going to cool. It means that this climate is going to stabilize and not change. And it's the rapid changing of the climate system that presents the biggest challenge that we're dealing with. And the other thing that is really important to understand about this chart is that that red triangle represents the nationally determined contributions. That's countries' assessment of what their emissions are going to be and what they've committed to in terms of emission reduction. And there's a huge gap for 2030 between where we are, where we've committed so far, and where we need to be, even to meet 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So there's a lot of work to do, and we are behind. We need to accelerate these trends of clean energy adoption even faster. Because we're seeing historic heat waves continues. This is from this summer. In the southern US, there were just absolutely crazy heat records. And many of you have probably seen this, but this just came out very, very recently. This past September, these are global temperatures for September over the last 150 years. This past September was warmer than any prior year by about 0.5 degrees Celsius. It was astronomical. And I know a lot of climate scientists who are scratching their heads right now, wondering what the heck is going on. Have we crossed some kind of climate tipping point, or is this some acceleration of warming that we didn't see, didn't know was coming? Either way, either of those options are very bad news. And it's a blaring red siren from the climate system that we're going into uncharted territory. And it's really important. I don't think folks fully understand the extent to which climate scientists are looking at the data and saying, hey, wait a second, things aren't right here. Here's a few quotes from some prominent climate scientists. What we're seeing this year is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of what we expect to happen. The impacts are frighteningly more impactful than I and many climate scientists I know expected. We're in truly uncharted territory in terms of the history of human civilization on this planet. And if we do not halt global warming soon, then the extreme events we see this year will pale against the ones that are to come. This is what's happening, and we need to pay attention here and really accelerate our ambition. Things are unprecedented. This is a recent survey from young people globally that was published a year or two ago. They surveyed 16 to 25-year-olds in a bunch of countries. And what they found is that 3/4 of young people think the future is frightening due to climate change. More than half of young people think humanity is doomed. And that's just really distressing. And it's a real challenge for us to deal with. And it's based on the fact that they're seeing these trends play out. The challenge, but we can't stop there. We can't stop with the doom. The challenges that we're facing is we need to hold both of these realities in our minds at the same time. Both the devastating climate impacts and the exciting and accelerating momentum to solve the climate crisis. If we can do this, we're going to harness the urgency, leadership, and optimism needed to drive action at the scale and pace necessary to address this challenge. So what does this look like? This is where we are today. The barriers to climate solutions can seem high at times. And the climate impacts, while they may seem like they're getting bad, they're actually still pretty low at the global scale of things. And we're expecting them to get much worse. So there's a lot of work to do. And we have to figure out ways to reduce these barriers to the climate solutions. And a lot of it is mental, reframing how we're thinking about these kinds of things. So here's a little bit of advice. We're in the implementation decade. It's no longer, is it possible to electrify my home? No, we got to say, I'm electrifying my home. What's my first step? What am I going to do? Okay, here's another one. No more like, how are national Democrats going to fix the climate? No, it's what can my state and federal representative, Republican or Democrat, do to act on climate? And this is critical. We need Republicans in this space also. We need everybody at the table for durable climate solutions. And we need everybody's best ideas. I know there's a hot mess in national politics right now, but it doesn't matter. We need folks to step up to the plate and show up and start implementing solutions, both at the state and federal level. There's a lot we can be doing, and it's critical that we have Republicans in this fight. We're no longer, and take it from my buddy Baby Yoda. It's no longer like, oh, EVs don't work for 100% of my needs today. We need to be thinking about how EVs are more fun to drive and better for the environment. How do you make the switch? And the skeleton key that's going to unlock the EV adoption for the next couple of years is going to be, homes that have 2 vehicles. One of those vehicles probably can be an EV, even if you have keep your gas vehicle around for longer road trips. But a lot of vehicles can be switched over to EVs right now. And that's going to drive those numbers up. And then we're going to see, success begets success, and we'll start seeing these solutions become more widely available. So as we move forward through this space, we're going to cross a tipping point at some point where climate impacts are getting worse and worse, and people are realizing, hey, we have got to deal with this. And at the same time, the barriers that we've had to climate solutions are getting lower and lower. Charging is going to be more ubiquitous. We're going to have longer range EVs. Everybody's going to be electrifying their home. Tipping points occur at a personal level in yourself, but then they can aggregate up to a societal level where everybody's thinking about the same things. And we need to be open and help each other to cross these tipping points personally and as a society. And it's a matter of reframing your own mind. It's also a matter of saying, okay, so-and-so says, there's this problem with clean energy. Well, what's the solution? Because it's not an option to just stop and not deploy things and just like stop history. We're moving towards cleaner, more affordable, more reliable energy. And we need to find solutions to how to get there. If we don't do it, someone else will. And I'd rather have the US and Utah be making these climate solutions. And eventually, we're going to get far enough along this curve to where there are no barriers to climate solutions. And climate impacts, while they're going to be high, they will have stabilized. And that's where we get to a new era of sustainability. And that's where we're heading, folks. In the future, and I don't know if this is in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but it's coming soon. Burning fossil fuels for energy use is going to be the technological equivalent of using a VHS, and it's the moral equivalent of smoking. People are going to look at you weird, like, oh, I can't believe you're burning something and polluting our local environment to make energy. Why don't you just use the electric thing that's clean? So I'm going to wrap up here now, and I want to end with a quote from Mr. O.P. Hood. This is from 1926. He was the chief mechanical engineer in the U.S. Bureau of Mines, and he was working in Salt Lake on our air quality back in 1926. And one of the things he said is that continuous, never-ceasing effort is required to clean up a smoky city. Few months of relaxation and years of effort are canceled. And what he was talking about is, these large environmental challenges require dedicated effort and policy focus and individual actions over years. And we're still working on air quality challenges today, a century later. And that's true of several environmental challenges. Think of the Great Salt Lake. We had one good winter, but one good winter with a lot of water isn't going to solve our problems. We need continued policy focus on this, because we never know when the drought's going to come back, and we need to have margins. And that's true for climate change as well. We need to keep working on it. In Utah this past summer, we've had a relatively benign climate year in terms of climate impacts here in Utah. We didn't have super smoky skies, and it was warm, but it wasn't extremely hot. And we had a lot of water this past winter. That's not going to continue. There's weather variability, and in a different year we'll be the losers of climate impacts. And so we need to keep the accelerator down. We need to keep accelerating our ambition. And this is my message. We're at the convergence of urgency and opportunity. We need to harness both of those narratives and both of those realities in order to move forward. And there's a lot to be done. And let's get to work. So with that, I'll stop here and I'll open up for question or discussion.
Logan, that's awesome. And I want to start with a question, but I also wanted to then let folks post some questions themselves. So if you have a question, please either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Logan, we'll make sure that folks have your email. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen for the moment. That way that folks can easier to see who's raised their hand and who's not on my end. So Logan, you've been watching this space for a long time, and as a scientist, but I know that you're particularly, when watching the solution space. So what's a technology or a trend that's really exciting you, that's jumping out, you're excited about?
I'm really excited. I mean, I'm really excited about the pace of EV adoption. Just a few years ago, it's hard to even imagine, to think back to 2018. 2018 was just 5 short years ago. And at that time, Tesla's first, mass market EV was just starting to roll off the lines. And people didn't know if Tesla was going to live or die, and as a company. And what it's done is it's completely reshaped the market. And every major automaker is now committed to phasing out internal combustion vehicles in about a decade. It's just astronomical to me. The pace of change and the shifting of perspective that's happened over the last 5 years. The other thing that's really exciting for me is heat pump technology, and how fast and how far that's come, to where, it used to be that nobody thought, like, okay, we're going to electrify our homes. That was just not really practical 5 years ago. In some places, in many places in like the Southeast, where you have more mild climates, a lot of people have fully electric homes, but in cold weather places, it wasn't seen as a practical solution. And that's just completely flipped now. Maine is the leader of heat pump technology in the US. And I think Norway and Sweden are deploying massive numbers of heat pumps. It's also interesting to me to see how geopolitical events are affecting the pace and ambition of what's happening. Russia invaded Ukraine, and that roiled global energy markets and made natural gas incredibly expensive. And in Europe, as a response to that, there was a lot of hardship and a lot of consternation about how that was going to play out. But now, a year or two down the road, a lot of the analysts are thinking that Europe has made a decade's worth of progress in a year or two in terms of deploying clean energy technologies, because it's a national security objective. And it's an imperative to get off of Russian natural gas. So.
And I would say that that's a really important thing, that we know that, it's in some ways Europe is seen as a cautionary tale. at the same time that, given some of the closures of nuclear plants and some other areas, but they really have made a big leap over the past year, which I think shows, as we're embracing a transition that is cleaner and reducing our, security vulnerabilities, we can make real progress. We can do that kind of work. Glenn Wright has a question. Glenn, are you in a position to ask it?
I can ask it, but it's in the chat, and my question is.
I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah. My question is to Logan. Great presentation. What are the first next steps you would like to see from the Utah state government and the U.S. government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest opportunities that Utah has is to double down on our building emissions and figure out how to update our building codes so that we're making smart investments in our building stock and being and addressing those emissions. And the reason why is because it actually ties into our air quality history. A major focus over the last century in Utah has been air quality. And as part of that, a century ago, we all used coal to heat our homes, coal and wood to heat our homes. And natural gas is much cleaner than coal and wood. And that has been incredibly important tool for us to address air pollution and get a cleaner air quality. But we're at the next step now. We're at the next phase. And because of that history, Utah has the highest percentage of homes heated by natural gas of any state in the country. And there are huge incentives now. There are really great incentives for electrifying your home and getting heat pumps. And so because we have the highest percentage of homes heated by natural gas, it also means we have the highest number of homes that are eligible for these incentives. And so there's a real opportunity to take advantage of these tax credits and improve our building stock and further improve our air quality and ensure we're set up for the future.
Yeah, and Logan, I'll add that I put in a link to the one of the pages for energy efficiency and electrification on our Utah Clean Energy's website. We're trying to keep tabs on some of the new tax credits and incentives that are available. Some have said that effectively that the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act has given a lot of customers, people, an effectively savings account to allow you to invest in energy efficiency, electrification, EV charging equipment. And so it's well worth checking those things out, particularly those energy efficiency measures. No regret strategies will save you money, will also help reduce emissions and help control that building sector where we're going to have to make some improvements, but the technology is available and that the costs are more competitive than they've ever been. Glenn, to the other thing, there's certainly lots of elements that our national government and our state government could take on. I think we're really pleased that Governor Cox and officials within the Office of Energy Development, which is our state energy office, and the state Department of Environmental Quality are really digging in to make use of new grants and new funds that are available to help reduce emissions from trucks, trucking, school buses in our buildings, and particularly some solar initiatives. There's a lot of work to be done there, but it's some important first steps. I would encourage everyone, if you are interested, to take a look at the Division of Air Quality's Beehive Emissions Reduction Plan website. There's a planning process, the first in a very long time at a state level, to look at ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and come up with a strategy that works for Utah. And we know that sort of for the moment at the national level that there are politics is very challenging, but one that there are important things we can do to help expedite clean energy development and also to look at how we can push forward with some sort of border adjusted carbon pricing. Those are things that I think we've heard serious proposals from both sides of the aisle, and we want our congressional delegation and others to kind of focus in there. Don, thank you, Glenn. Don, please ask your question.
I wonder what is the way we can get better information to developers on the CPACE program. It's a great program for incentivizing a more efficient building. It ensures that the lender and that the buyer, the developer will have a lower cost loan. We approved that in Provo in 2016, and our first use of CPACE is just going through the process here in Provo now in 2023. That's 7 years. 7 years. It's just like, you know, how can they ignore all the benefits of CPACE? That's for those who don't know it. It's the title is not very helpful, but it basically allows developers to get a better loan because the local city sort of guarantees that the lender is going to get their money back. But how can we get the word out?
Don, I don't have. I mean, first of all, I'll say that this is a lesson in being impressive, but also the challenges of being an early adopter and filling up a new space. And there are so many opportunities to save money and energy in our commercial institutional buildings to reduce emissions and sort of lead by example. And we really appreciate that the work that you've done and others have done in Provo City, and I know that Salt Lake City have done through their Elevate Buildings program. So that we're only scratching the surface there. I think that there have been some challenges with the structure of the commercial PACE program, but it's something particularly as new sources of funding and potentially lending, financing that come available, we really need to be sort of scratching into that area. So I don't have a good answer for your question, you know, directly, but I think for everyone who's working in the municipal public space, this is a really important area to keep working on. And I think, Don, we can connect with you, but also some of the other communities that are trying to really dig in on commercial PACE and, you know, that sector to see what we can ramp up.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or maybe challenges, early adoption experiences that folks want to share with technologies or questions you have for Logan?
Or what are questions that, you know, when people come to you and say, you know, we can't address climate change for XYZ reason, what are the questions that they're bringing to you that you need help with?
I have a question that's sort of unrelated to that, but as just kind of an individual person who cares about climate and who isn't necessarily doing leading work like you are, what can I do? Like, other than buy an electric vehicle, how do I do anything, I guess, as just an average everyday person living in the state?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the most important things you can do that one of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Hayo, talks about is just talking about climate change, having conversations about it with your family, with your neighbors, with hopefully policymakers. That's a super important thing, just to have the conversation, because a lot of people just don't talk about it, and that's part of the reason why we're not addressing it. I think the other thing is, I mean, it is reducing your emissions in a personal way, but also encouraging policymakers. You know, we need systemic solutions. We need, you know, when you go to a car dealership, there needs to be electric vehicles on the lot being sold, you know, and if they're not there, then nobody's going to buy an electric vehicle. And And that really, policy drives those kinds of things. You know, when you flip the light switch in your home, you don't get to choose whether you get clean energy or not, unless you put solar panels on your home. But for most of us, we don't get to choose where PacifiCorp or Rocky Mountain Power is getting their electricity from. We need policy to drive those changes so that our lives are have lower emissions.
And Logan, I might add that just, I mean, it can be overwhelming. And so, you know, certainly no one needs to do everything. I think that Catherine Hayo's book, I think it's called Saving Us. Sorry for the exact title. Has a lot of ways in which connecting with folks in your network within ways that is just so powerful and so important. And I also think at the local level, whether it's not just your funds or your decisions, but there's a lot of discussion about how we move over. Don was talking about public buildings and public schools. That's an area where there happens to be a lot of funding, whether it's the buildings themselves for efficiency improvements or solar or school buses. And so asking your city council members or your local officials, what are you seeking to take advantage of? And it doesn't necessarily have to be renewable energy. It could also be active transportation. You know, I think that these things help build momentum for us as a community to address these challenges. You know, even if you're a renter or there are other ways you know, we're all financially constrained. It's not just about our personal finances. There's also just a lot of decisions to be made and folks may not be aware.
Hey, Josh, I like that last question of what can an individual do? And I liked Logan's response about keeping the conversation going. But it seems like that could easily devolve into, well, climate change is real, is not, is so, is not, is so. Do you happen to have, you know, a talking point, 1-pager or 2-pager of, you know, key points, key issues, key themes that a layperson could use in conversation with others that you might share with us?
So this is, I don't have a 1-pager like you're asking, because there's just so much out there and it really depends on what the question is. And I think that this is where I'm going to come back to the presentation. This is where I think that these two concepts and understanding that there's these two narratives out there can be helpful, because oftentimes people are not really opposed to having a cleaner environment. They might be opposed to, you know, what they see as giving something up, or they may think that we're already doomed, you know, like things are already too far along. And so what I have been finding helpful in the last couple of months as I've been thinking about this dual narrative concept is I try to understand what somebody is asking. What's behind what they're asking. Sometimes they might ask about, you know, the science question, but that's not really what they're asking. They're actually asking about, how is my life going to change? How are my kids' lives going to change? And so understanding the values that are underneath the questions and finding common ground. So the most important thing when you're starting new conversations or continuing old conversations is finding common ground. And so understand where the person is coming from and try to meet them there first, whether they're, you know, concerned about the climate, or maybe they think that the solutions are so bad that they're just going to totally ignore it. Try to meet them there first in that narrative. And then and what I've been realizing is, like, I start putting people into buckets. You know, do they understand the climate urgency piece, or do they understand the climate opportunity piece better? And I'll meet them there first, and then I'll start bridging into the other narrative so that they have a balance, because I think we need both of them to understand where we are today in the context of what's driving the market and where we're heading in the future.
I think that's helpful, Logan. But assuming that we can kind of get to that point in conversations with others as to, look, we're not doomed, we can do something about it. Seems like what the layperson would want to be able to say then is, and here are 2 or 3 things that we can do to have an impact. And that's where I feel like I'm in short grass. That's where I feel like I could use some additional information.
Matt, I think that's helpful. And I think we have some resources that I think are available to us. We haven't had developed a recent fact sheet saying exactly those things. And I think but I think there's something that we can go back and work with some of our national partners and share something. I think that's a good pivot. And it is, I will say, it is individual to folks that you know or folks that you talk to, because I think that the field is broad and we hear such a broad range of discussions on this. Understandably, it's so all encompassing. And so I think that but there are things to 1 or 2 points to empower folks to sort of dig in. Important point. I noticed that Sarah Bateman had a question. Sarah, and I didn't call on you at the time, and I wanted to make sure that if you have a question for Logan or for us, that you can ask it.
Thank you. It was just, again, I know that there have been some comments that have made about, the overall transportation ecosystem, including transit and that kind of thing. Question that I hear a lot regarding specifically EVs is the infrastructure going to be robust enough to withstand a conversion to an all EV system? A lot of times people will point to California and how it's been affecting the grid, and it's insufficient to support that. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions about EVs, and it seems to come up a lot. And this is where I think it's helpful. It's what I want to encourage folks to try to do in their minds is to reframe the question in terms of, is it going to be possible for the grid to sustain EVs? I think that's not the right question to be asking right now. The question is, we're going to see EVs. How are we going to make the grid sustain them? And the answer to that is, there's a lot of really smart people working on this. PacifiCorp and Rocky Mountain Power are planning for EVs. They're planning for that additional load. They're planning to build out resources to accommodate that. And I don't want to just sugarcoat it and brush it aside. It's not like there aren't going to be challenges. There are, but America can solve big challenges. That's what we do. That's what we are really good at. And we need to look at this as a challenge to be solved, not as like, oh, this is going to be impossible. How are we going to do it? We just give up. We should just give up now. But the answer, it is possible. And there's a lot of good data and there's a lot of good economic analysis to show that we can do it. Absolutely, no question. But we need to get after it. We need to be doing the planning, and it's not like it's going to happen overnight. This is going to happen. New car sales. I think within a decade, we're going to be at probably close to 90 to 100% EV sales. That's what I think is going to happen. That's the trend that we've seen in other countries, and that's the trajectory that we're on. But that doesn't mean that 100% of the cars on the road are EVs. No, the percentage of registration, even though right now Utah is at about 8 to 9% of new car sales are EVs, we're still only at 1% of the cars on the road are EVs. So that the number of cars on the road that are EVs lags several years behind. And so we can see that additional load coming, and we can plan for it. We have to plan for it. We have to build out for it. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need to get after it.
And I think that just for better and for worse, we are going to have to need to improve our grid anyway. We need more transmission. We need to find a way to use storage. We need probably some adjustments in our tech and how we do rates for customers with more sort of time variance. But we also just need to harden the grid. We're seeing wild swings in temperatures, wildfires. So it's like the work that needs to be done in that space, it's doable, but it will require an effort that will accompany the work of cleaning up our grid to harden it, to make it better and more amenable to electrifying more items and more end uses. It's entirely doable, but it will require certainly some work and some focus. And Connie had a similar sort of question just about and I think we are looking, Connie, about regulations and permitting that's in staffing to make sure that we can expedite transmission. Some other areas, it's a tough, thorny issue about how exactly to do that, but it's one where there's some promising, I think, national conversations among bipartisan between Republicans and Democrats to do that. Logan, and thank you, Sarah, for the question. Brandon, you had a question about EVs. Brandon Do about EVs and EV distances.
Yeah, I think my question's a lot along the line of Sarah's, but I think that recently I've even seen posts from friends that like rented an EV to go on a trip, and it became really difficult to find charging stations and was a negative experience. I'm wondering, Logan and Josh, what your thoughts are behind that, how we can spin that into more of a positive thing, because I think EVs are the future, and obviously infrastructure needs to improve and all that kind of thing. But how do we get a better messaging system out about when you want to drive from Salt Lake to Vegas to make that a positive experience versus spinning it to negative?
Yeah, and I think that this will take some time, and there's going to be some bumps along the way. I can tell you from my own personal experience about long distance traveling with an EV, because I got a Tesla Model 3 in 2018 when Tesla was right at that tipping point. And we kind of got it as like, hey, let's see if this works. It had 300 miles of range, and we wanted to see, how much could we actually use it. And it turns out, we've had it for about 5 years now. We've just passed 95,000 miles on it, and we basically use it for all of our road trips now. We go out of our way to take our electric car versus our gas car. And part of the reason why is because Tesla built out this phenomenal charging network. I have driven south to Phoenix, west to San Francisco and Portland, north to Jackson in the middle of winter to go skiing, east to Boulder, basically every direction from Salt Lake. And it works great. It works. It's totally reliable. It works. We've never had an issue. We've only ever had to wait for charging a couple of times in 5 years. So that's, you might say like, okay, that's great for Tesla owners. What about everybody else? Everybody else has a different plug, and the charging network, especially for long distance road trips, is not as reliable. But that's changing. It's changing because more plugs are being deployed. But the really big news and really exciting news is that basically every major automaker Tesla has made a deal to open source their connector and make it an international or a standard plug instead of their proprietary plug. Starting next year, any EV, all of the major automakers are going to have access to the Tesla charging network. You have to get an adapter to make the plugs work, but you're going to start having access to all of the Tesla chargers that are out there. And then starting in 2025, so a year and a half from now, every major automaker has announced plans to install the Tesla plug natively into their car. So what's going to happen, I think, is people might actually delay buying EVs for a year or two to wait until the cars all have the right plug to be able to just natively be able to charge from the Tesla charging network. But I think in 2025, you're going to see, a lot of advertising about how, such and such new car from Ford or GM has access to the Tesla charging network, and you can charge basically anywhere.
I just want to say that there is the state, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, is rolling out. The UDOT and probably with Rocky Mountain Power and some others have electric vehicle charging infrastructure programs that are going to be ramping up. So that it will take a few years, but in terms of both improving technology and connectivity, and then also investment in fast charging infrastructure and other charging infrastructure, we're likely to see it continue to rise and go up, particularly on major highway corridors like between here and Vegas. I want to respect. We're coming up on time. Logan, Joan, and Norma have questions basically about Rocky Mountain Power and geothermal. And I just thought if you have like maybe a 1 to 2 minute answer about, some of the clean, firm technologies that we're seeing and how some of the exciting stuff there, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is an area where I'm tracking very closely. And one of the things that I'm most excited about in the next few years is that here in Utah, we have this really great research facility called Utah Forge, looking at pioneering new geothermal techniques, drilling techniques that can enable geothermal energy production. And we also have a private company that's developing that resource, taking that technology, transferring it to the private sector, and then actually developing it. And if they're successful, and so far they're just knocking it out of the park, this is going to completely change energy markets, electricity markets, because if they're successful, you can basically drill using this new geothermal drilling technique, you can make geothermal almost anywhere across the states. And here in the West, if the costs decline as they think that they might, we could see a third of our energy coming from geothermal resources in the future. So it's massive. There's some really exciting innovation happening in energy markets, and especially with geothermal, and that's happening right here in Utah, and it's super exciting.
And it'll be interesting to see. We're certainly pushing our utilities to look into those technologies, some of those earlier, as a complement to solar, wind, and energy storage resources, because they have a different operating profile. So that's a new but exciting opportunity, and one that we have a great resource here in Utah, as Logan was saying, to take advantage of. I want to end here and I know that there's some more questions. I've taken them down. We'll try to follow up on those, and to thank Logan, first of all, for his time and his presentation, and for sharing his expertise, but also for all of you for joining us and making this a great